Last night, when I told my parents I was excited for tomorrow's family reunion, my sister laughed. "You're not invited." That wasn't just an insult. It was confirmation my family had chosen sides right before the secret meeting to oust me from my position. What they don't know is that I now own the company's hidden debt. Tomorrow, their reunion will coincide with a different one. The reunion of truth with the receipts and recordings locked in my safe. My name is Clara Wynne. I am 34 years old, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Northlake Dynamics, the technology logistics company my father started in his garage and that I built into an industry competitor. The house I'm standing in, my parents' house in Brookshore Heights, is a product of that success. It smells of lemon polish and old money, a scent that has always managed to feel both comforting and suffocating. The only sounds in the cavernous living room are the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that has measured my entire life in precise, unforgiving increments, and the gentle clink of ice in my father's glass of scotch. The light from the kitchen spills a sickly yellow path across the polished oak floor. Stopping just short of my shoes, it doesn't dare touch the Persian rug where my family is assembled. My mother, Marjorie, adjusts a porcelain bird on the mantelpiece, her movements small and nervous. My father, Harold, stares into his drink as if it holds the solution to a complex routing problem, and my sister, Sable, sits on the edge of an armchair, a picture of relaxed poise. At 31, she is the head of human resources, a title that suits her talent for managing human assets, including our parents. I had just mentioned the family reunion scheduled for the next day, a simple, innocuous statement. "I'm looking forward to it," I'd said. "It's been a while since we all got together at the estate." Sable's laugh was not loud. It was a small, sharp puff of air, perfectly calibrated. She looked at me, a brilliant, predatory smile playing on her lips, the kind that always charmed journalists and disarmed board members. "You're not invited." The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. The ticking of the clock seemed to hesitate. My father swirled his scotch, the ice rattling a frantic rhythm against the glass. My mother froze, her hand hovering over the porcelain bird's head. It was not a joke. It was a declaration, a verdict delivered without a trial. This wasn't just about a barbecue at Wynne Hollow, our family estate. The annual reunion had for years been a convenient fiction. It was the unofficial, off-the-books shareholder summit, the place where the real decisions for Northlake Dynamics were made over catered sandwiches and iced tea. This year, the invitation list had been revised. I was no longer a win. I was a liability. The internal retreat, as the official email to the chosen few had called it, was a coup. And I was the deposed monarch who hadn't yet been informed of her execution. My mother finally broke the silence, turning from the mantelpiece with a strained, placating smile. "Clara, darling, it's complicated this year. We just wanted a day with less pressure, no shop talk." Her gaze skittered away from mine, landing somewhere on the wall behind me. "Don't bring the company into a family meal, Clara," my father mumbled into his glass, his voice thick with a cowardice I knew too well. He was the founder, the patriarch, but his spine had long ago been replaced by a desire for a peaceful life, a peace he was willing to purchase at any price, even his eldest daughter. Harmony, peace, these were the words they used to justify erasure. For years. I had been the engine of Northlake, the one who worked through the nights, who wrote the proprietary routing algorithms in my college dorm room, who scaled the operations from 4 trucks to 400. Sable was the face, the brand. Softer, my mother always said. Better for PR. I was operations. She was optics. I was the foundation. She was the beautiful, smiling facade. And now, the facade had decided the foundation was unnecessary. My phone buzzed silently in my pocket, a low, insistent vibration against my leg. I didn't need to look. I knew the sender, my legal counsel, Marcus Thorne, a man who communicated with the same brutal efficiency as a well-oiled machine. I slipped my hand into my pocket, my thumb finding the screen. The message was brief, a single line under the subject, Plan K. Covenant transfer complete. Activation protocols are green. Awaiting your signal. A wave of cold, clarifying calm washed over me. Plan K. The last resort. The lever I had built in the dark while they were busy sharpening their knives in the light. The debt. The $18 million bridge loan Northlake had taken on 6 months ago. Brokered by Damon Kress, our CEO, to fund an expansion I had advised against. A loan from a discreet private equity firm, buried in which was a standard but lethal covenant. A change of control clause. Any significant shift in the company's voting power or executive leadership would trigger an immediate call on the full amount. And 3 weeks ago, through a series of shell corporations and third-party brokers, I had purchased that debt. I was the company's ghost creditor, the hand holding the switch. I pulled my hand from my pocket and looked at Sable. Her smile was still in place, unwavering. She was enjoying this, the quiet, surgical removal of her older sister. Try not to bring too much drama to the estate tomorrow. Sable, I said, my voice even, almost conversational. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. It won't be drama. It's just business. Drama finds its own way, I replied. It tends to follow bad business. The memory of a recording, saved and encrypted on 3 separate devices, played in my mind. I didn't need to hear it. The words were etched into my brain. It was a phone call between Sable and Damon, my ex-boyfriend and the man they had installed as CEO to be my superior, a man I had once trusted. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. Once the voting shares are consolidated under my authority, we can proceed with the personnel realignment, Sable had said, her voice stripped of its usual warmth, leaving only cold ambition. The redundancy list is prepared. And Clara? Damon's voice, the same voice that had once whispered promises to me. She won't see it coming. Dad will fold. Mom will follow. By the time she realizes she's out, we'll have a new COO in place. Someone who fits the new culture. Someone not on her team. A purge. They were planning to fire dozens of loyal employees, people who had been with us for years, simply because their allegiance was to me, to the operational stability I represented. Not to the reckless, image-obsessed expansion Damon and Sable were pushing. They called it a culture shift. I called it a betrayal. I walked over to the mahogany sideboard where an unopened bottle of Chateau Margaux sat. It was a 2005 vintage my father had been saving for a special occasion. My promotion to COO, perhaps. He'd never opened it. I picked it up, the glass cool and heavy in my hands. I ran my thumb over the foil-wrapped cork. Let's save this, I said, placing the bottle carefully back in its velvet-lined cradle. We should have something to celebrate with tomorrow. Sable's smile widened, her eyes glinting with victory. She thought the celebration was hers. She thought I was conceding. Oh, she purred, leaning forward. And who will we be celebrating? I met her gaze directly. Holding it for the first time all evening, I let the silence stretch, letting the clock in the hall tick off 2, 3, 4 seconds of their hollow triumph. I saw my father shift uncomfortably. I saw my mother's hand flutter to her throat. They knew, on some level, what they had done. They just didn't know what I was about to do. Whoever's left standing, I said. Then I turned and walked out of the room, my footsteps echoing on the oak floor, leaving them behind in the pale, yellow light. The storm was no longer coming. It had already arrived. They just couldn't feel the rain yet. Driving away from my parents' house, the sterile blue light of the dashboard was a welcome antidote to the sick yellow of their kitchen. Each green traffic light was a small permission to move forward, to put distance between myself and that room. But memory is not governed by distance. It operates on its own logistics, pulling cargo from the past without warning. Northlake Dynamics was born in the summer heat of my father's garage, amidst the smell of motor oil, damp concrete, and ambition. There were 4 trucks, 2 Fords, and 2 aging Kenworths he'd bought at auction. He had the grit, the trucker's intuition for the road, I had the code. I was 19, home from college for the summer, and I saw his routing problem not as a matter of roads, but of mathematics. I spent weeks fueled by coffee and a certainty that borders on arrogance, writing an algorithm on a clunky desktop computer. It was a messy string of code, but it worked. It optimized fuel consumption, calculated load balances, and shaved delivery times by an average of 12%. I watched from the garage door as my father, his hands permanently stained with grease, took my printout and saw not just numbers, but a future. That was our foundation, a father's hard work and a daughter's logic. As the money came in, the garage was replaced by a warehouse, then a corporate campus, the family dinners, once a welcome respite from work, slowly transformed. The dining table became an unofficial boardroom. Passing the salt was punctuated by discussions of quarterly earnings. My mother's questions about our lives were replaced by inquiries about market penetration. Family became the family council, a feudal term for a group of people who happened to share blood and stock options. Every Sunday dinner was a pre-brief for the Monday strategy session, a place to test alliances and float proposals in a low-stakes environment. I thrived in those early days. The company was a puzzle, a complex system to be optimized, and I was its chief architect. I saw every challenge as a variable, every solution as a line of code. My mother, Marjorie, loved the narrative we were building. In her mind, we were Win and Daughters, a charming, marketable story for business magazines. She would gesture to me and Sable and tell friends, "Harold built the engine, but the girls are the ones driving it now." It was a neat, tidy line, but it was inaccurate. I wasn't driving. I was in the engine room, monitoring pressure gauges and fuel lines. Sable was the one in the driver's seat, smiling for the cameras. Mother always championed Sable. "Clara is brilliant, of course," she'd say, a hint of apology in her voice. "But Sable has the soft skills. She connects with people. It's better for PR." The division of labor became our identity. I delivered results. Sable delivered the narrative about the results. At industry galas, I would be in a corner discussing freight capacity with a distribution manager while Sable was being photographed with a senator. Her laugh bright and effortless. The press clippings on my mother's corkboard told the whole story. Sable, shaking hands with the governor. Sable, cutting the ribbon on a new facility. Sable, accepting an award for community engagement. In most of the photos, I was a shape in the background, a blur of dark fabric. My face turned toward a screen or a colleague. I was the invisible mechanism that made the clock tick. She was the polished, smiling face that people admired. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was what mattered. The smooth, uninterrupted flow of goods across the continent. The logic of the system. The system became compromised the day I introduced Damon Kress. I met him at a tech conference. He was charismatic, sharp, and spoke the language of disruptive innovation that venture capitalists loved. I was, for a time, in love with him. I saw a partner, someone who understood the scale of my ambition. I brought him to my father. I vouched for him. We needed a CEO, a public face with the right pedigree to take us to the next level, to prepare us for a potential IPO. Damon was perfect. He charmed my father, flattered my mother, and treated Sable not as a little sister, but as a peer. He turned our family into his personal stage, and he quickly learned who the lead actress was meant to be. He and Sable became a unit, their ambition a feedback loop. Dinners became less about company strategy and more about their shared vision, a vision that was heavy on branding and light on operational reality. The first clear data point of the system's malfunction appeared 9 months ago. It was a subcontractor agreement with a carrier called Gray Line Freight. Damon was proud of the deal. It was part of his aggressive cost-cutting initiative. I read the contract on a Tuesday night. The rates were good, almost too good. Buried in the appendices, in the dense legalese, I found the poison pills. The penalty clauses for late deliveries weren't just steep. They were exponential, escalating with each missed deadline. And a separate exclusivity clause meant that if we used them for a specific high-volume route, we were locked in for 2 years. Greyline had a notoriously mediocre on-time record. The contract wasn't a partnership. It was a trap. I brought my analysis to the weekly leadership meeting. I had charts. I had projections. I modeled the potential financial exposure. The risk profile is unacceptable, I concluded. If there's a single supply chain disruption, a bad winter storm, a labor slowdown, these penalties could wipe out our profit margin for the entire quarter. Damon listened with a patient smile. When I was finished, he didn't address my data. He addressed the room. "I appreciate Clara's diligence," he said, his tone implying that my diligence was a quaint but impractical hobby. "But we can't let fear of worst-case scenarios paralyze us. We need to be bold. We need to be aggressive." Sable nodded in agreement, adding, "Sometimes being too focused on the negative can become a self-fulfilling prophecy." I was labeled. I was negative. I was risk-averse. I was the voice of caution in their echo chamber of ambition. A week later, I noticed I was no longer on the distribution list for the strategic planning emails. When I asked Damon's assistant, she gave me a flustered apology about a clerical error, but the error was never corrected. I was being firewalled, cut out of the data stream. The rumors started subtly. A manager in accounting asking an oblique question about the Wynn family trust. An overheard whisper in the hallway about a succession plan. The pieces began to connect. Damon and Sable weren't just pushing a new strategy. They were planning a new corporate structure, one that didn't include me in a position of power. The family trust held the majority of the voting shares. If my parents could be convinced to transfer their proxy to Sable, my own significant but minority stake would be rendered irrelevant. My approach to the problem was the only way I knew. As a systems analyst, betrayal was a foreign language, but data was my native tongue. I began my own audit, working late at night from my home office, using my still-active COO credentials to access the deepest levels of our servers. I wasn't looking for proof of betrayal. I was looking for anomalies in the system, and I found them. I found the ghost employees first, 3 logistics consultants on the HR payroll, drawing 6-figure salaries. Sable had approved their hires. A little digging revealed their payment accounts were linked to a shell corporation that traced back to a holding company owned by Damon. I found the secret retention bonuses, paid out to a select group of managers, all of whom were vocal supporters of Damon's new vision. Then I found the altered performance metrics. The original data from my operations team showed a slight decline in efficiency since the Greyline contract began. The reports that went to the board, however, showed a steady increase. The numbers were being massaged, the data corrupted to fit the narrative. I printed everything: the money transfers, the ghost timesheets, the original KPI dashboards and the falsified ones. I laid them out on the floor of my spare bedroom. It wasn't enough. I needed to see the connections, the flow. So, I mounted a large corkboard to the wall. Each person was an index card. Each transaction was a document. Each lie was a data point. I started connecting them with red yarn, not for drama, for logic, for clarity. It was a process map of their conspiracy. The red lines snaked from Damon to Sable, from Sable to the ghost employees, from the falsified reports back to the board members they were deceiving. It was ugly, complex, and undeniable. It was the algorithm of my family's decay. That web of string wasn't an act of madness. It was my answer, my code, my plan for debugging the system. The red string map on my wall was a diagnosis, not a cure. It showed me the pathology of the disease, the paths the infection had taken through the corporate body. But it couldn't excise the tumor. For that, I needed a scalpel, a tool of such precision and finality that the operation would be over before the patient even knew they were on the table. I found it on a Thursday night, buried on page 87 of the previous quarter's supplementary financial disclosures. It was an anodyne line item. Short-term debt financing, Facility B, unremarkable. Most analysts would have skimmed right past it. But I knew our cash flow. We didn't need a bridge loan, especially not an $18 million one. I pulled the full loan agreement from the corporate data vault. The lender was a boutique private equity firm out of state, Argentis Capital. The terms were standard, the interest rate aggressive but not predatory, and there, in Section 9, subsection 4A, was the mechanism. The covenant, the single, beautifully engineered tripwire they had unknowingly laid for themselves. It was a change of control provision, a standard piece of boilerplate designed to protect a lender from the instability of a corporate takeover. It stated that in the event of any material change in the company's controlling ownership, specifically defined to include a significant transfer of voting rights from one party to another, the lender had the right, at its sole discretion, to accelerate the loan. The full principal and accrued interest would become due and payable within 5 business days. They had financed their coup with a bomb and given the detonator to a stranger. I intended to become that stranger. The next morning, I didn't call my own lawyer. I called Marcus Thorne, a man whose name was only whispered in the most ruthless M&A circles. He specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate warfare. His firm operated with the moral neutrality of a mercenary. I engaged him through a holding company I'd established years ago for personal investments, a clean entity with no legal connection to my name. I gave him one directive: buy the Northlake Dynamics debt from Argentis Capital. Quietly, immediately. Marcus's team worked through a series of intermediaries. Argentis was a fund looking to de-risk its portfolio before the end of the fiscal year. The offer, a small premium over par, was attractive. They were happy to offload the debt of a family-run company that was, by all appearances, heading for an internal power struggle. To them, it was just a good trade. Within 72 hours, the transaction was complete. The ownership of the debt, and its powerful little covenant, was transferred to a numbered company registered in Delaware, a company whose sole director was me. The entire process was legal, ethical by the standards of corporate law, and completely invisible. I had disarmed their bomb and rewired the detonator to a switch in my own hand. Each clause in that document was a pin. Each legal term a tumbler and a lock I now held the key to. With the mechanism secured, I focused on timing. I cross-referenced the family reunion invitation, a PDF Sable had emailed to a select list, a copy of which was forwarded to me by a loyalist in the IT department. The reunion was scheduled from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. at Wynn Hollow. I knew that at the center of this folksy gathering would be a single pivotal moment. My parents, Harold and Marjorie Wynn, would sign a document transferring their voting authority for the family trust's shares to Sable. It would be framed as a temporary measure, a way to streamline decision-making. It was, in fact, the act of abdication, the substantive change of control, the very event that would trip the wire. 2 days later, the name of their plan landed in my inbox. It was another forwarded email, this one with a higher security classification. The subject line was Operation Juniper. It was a 30-day transition plan, authored by Damon, outlining the seamless replacement of the current COO with a candidate more aligned with the new strategic vision. It detailed the communications strategy, the talking points for the board, and the severance package they intended to offer me. They had given their betrayal a project name, as if it were just another product launch. I forwarded it to Marcus with one word: activate. The silent surveillance began. Marcus's team, working with a cybersecurity firm, initiated a legal and court-approved monitoring of all digital traffic related to Northlake servers. It wasn't a hack. It was an audit, justified by my fiduciary duty as COO to investigate potential fraud, the evidence of which I had already documented. We started tracking access badge logs, VPN connections, and server room activity. The data flowed in, cold and irrefutable. Time-stamped entries showed Sable's badge accessing the primary server room at 2:13 a.m., 2:19 a.m., and 2:27 a.m. on 3 consecutive nights. The server logs for those exact times showed administrator-level access to the financial reporting databases. They weren't just planning a coup. They were actively altering the historical record. The night before the reunion, last night, the final piece of the puzzle arrived. It was a metadata report from the audit. At 11:42 p.m., Damon Kress had used his personal Gmail account to send an email to the third-party vendor that managed our performance analytics software. The message was short. "Hi, Mark. Following up on our call, please proceed with the aesthetic adjustments to the Q3 KPI dashboards we discussed. Need them to look clean for the retreat tomorrow. Thanks, D." Aesthetic adjustments. That was the term he used for fraud. He was clumsy enough to put the request in writing, arrogant enough to think his personal email was a secure channel. It was the last nail. I now had proof of his direct intent to deceive. While he was ordering his vendor to paint over the truth, I was in my own system, using my master's COO credentials. I accessed the one place they couldn't touch, the cold storage archive. It's a write once, read many system, an immutable digital vault where a snapshot of all company data is stored every 24 hours for disaster recovery. It cannot be altered or deleted without a complex series of physical and digital keys, most of which resided with me. I initiated a download of the raw, unadjusted KPI data for the last 6 months, the original files, the pristine truth, saved as a series of encrypted files on a solid-state drive that I now held in my hand. With all the pieces in place, I sat at my desk. The city lights glittered outside my window, a sprawling grid of interconnected systems, all running on logic and rules. My own system was now ready to run. I took a piece of my personal stationery and a pen. I wrote a short letter, folded it, and placed it in an envelope. On the front, I wrote my own name. "To future Clara," it read, "tomorrow morning, you will hold the entire company in your hand. They built it on family. You rebuilt it on a foundation of truth. Do not flinch when you flip the switch." I placed the letter on my nightstand, across the room. The digital clock on my wall changed from 11:59 p.m. to 12:00 a.m., a new day. I picked up my phone and set an alarm for 5:30 a.m. There was no anxiety, no rage. There was only a profound and chilling sense of calm. The machine was built. The code was compiled. All that was left was to press execute. Wynn Hollow Estate greeted the morning with a performance of idyllic family life. The sun filtered through the old oak trees, dappling the sprawling lawn where long tables were dressed in red and white checkered cloths. The air smelled of cut grass, blooming hydrangeas, and the sweet scent of batter from a commercial-grade waffle maker humming near the patio. Cousins I hadn't seen in a year chased their children across the grass, their laughter a bright, carefree sound that felt like it belonged to a different world. It was a perfect picture, a meticulously crafted illusion of familial harmony, bought and paid for by the profits of Northlake Dynamics. From my car, parked on a gravel path overlooking the scene, I watched them. They were all there, aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole extended apparatus of the Wynn clan. They were the shareholders, the board members, the beneficiaries of the trust. They were the jury for a trial they didn't even know was happening. My phone buzzed. 11:15 a.m., a message from Marcus. Showtime. I didn't enter through the main lawn. I used the old service entrance that led directly into the west wing of the house, to the library. The library had always been my father's sanctuary, a room of dark wood, worn leather, and the hushed silence of unread books. Today, it was their signing chamber. Through the slightly ajar door, I could see them. The scene was staged like a historical painting. My father stood by the fireplace, looking out the window at the party, his back to the room. My mother sat in a wingback chair, twisting a handkerchief in her hands, and in the center of the room, at my father's massive mahogany desk, sat Sable. She was arranging a document inside a handsome dark blue leather portfolio. It was the share proxy agreement, the instrument of my execution. Her voice was smooth, gentle, the tone one uses to soothe a nervous animal. "It's just a formality, Mom. It simplifies the voting process. It allows us to be more agile." She looked up at our father. "Dad, everything is ready." He turned from the window, his face a mask of weary resignation. He walked toward the desk, his steps heavy. He was halfway there when I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My timing was perfect. My entrance had the jarring effect of a film reel tearing. 3 heads snapped toward me. My father stopped dead. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Sable's placid expression hardened instantly, her eyes narrowing into slits. I was dressed for a boardroom, not a barbecue. A stark white silk shirt, black trousers, and low heels that made no sound on the thick Persian rug. My hair was pulled back. My face was bare of makeup. In my hand, I carried a simple, brushed tin box, the kind used for storing documents or index cards. It was plain, functional, and utterly out of place. "Clara," Sable's voice was a blade of ice. "I believe I made it clear. This is a private family event." "It is," I agreed, my voice calm and even as I walked toward the desk. "It's also a meeting with a direct and material bearing on an outstanding debt obligation of Northlake Dynamics." I placed the tin box on the corner of the desk with a soft, definitive click. The corporate jargon, so alien to this wood-paneled room, hung in the air like smoke. My father flinched, but Sable held her ground. "What are you talking about? This has nothing to do with the company's finances." "On the contrary," I said, looking directly at her, "it has everything to do with them." I reached into my jacket pocket and produced 2 folded documents. I placed the first one on top of the leather portfolio, directly in front of her. "This is a notice of debt assignment. As of 3 weeks ago, the $18 million bridge loan issued by Argentus Capital was sold. Argentus is no longer our creditor." My father's face went pale. "Sold? To who?" "We'll get to that," I said, my gaze never leaving Sable. I placed the second document next to the first. "And this is a formal declaration from the new debt holder, exercising their right under Section 9, subsection 4A of the loan agreement. It notifies the board that any substantive change in the company's controlling ownership will trigger the acceleration clause. The full $18 million, plus interest, will become due and payable within 5 business days of such a change." I tapped the leather portfolio with my finger. "The document you are about to sign, which transfers the voting rights of the majority shareholder trust, constitutes, without question, a substantive change of control. The moment your pen touches that paper, you start a 5-day countdown to insolvency." Silence. The only sound was the distant, happy shouting of a child on the lawn outside. Sable stared at the documents, her carefully constructed composure beginning to fracture. She looked from the papers to my face, searching for a bluff. She found none. "You're lying," she whispered. "This is a trick, some kind of desperate—" I didn't let her finish. I reached for the tin box and unlatched its simple clasp. The lid opened with a faint metallic sigh. "I've learned, sister, that desperation is unnecessary when you have data." I reached inside and began to place the contents on the polished desk, creating a small, damning collage around her precious portfolio. First, the encrypted USB drive. The complete, unedited server logs from the past 6 months, including multiple instances of after-hours access to the finance servers, originating from your keycard. Sable. Next, a stack of invoices, bound with a clip. Invoices and payment records for 3 ghost consultants in the HR department, totaling over $400,000, funneled through a shell corporation owned by our CEO. Then, the server access logs in hard copy, with key entries highlighted in yellow. The log files showing the exact moments the quarterly KPI data was accessed and overwritten, followed by printouts of both the original data from my operations team and the aesthetically adjusted versions that were presented to the board. Finally, I laid down a single sheet of paper. It was a transcript. "And this is a transcript of a phone call recorded 2 weeks ago. I believe you'll recognize the title, Operation Juniper." My father made a choked sound and staggered back, sinking into a leather chair. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. My mother was no longer looking at me, or at Sable, or at the evidence. She was staring at her own hands in her lap, her face a crumpled mask of disbelief and shame. She had chosen the wrong daughter, and the bill for that choice had just arrived. Sable was frozen, her eyes wide with a horror that was slowly being replaced by a seething rage. She was cornered. I looked past her, to my Uncle Gene, my father's younger brother, who had silently entered the room when he saw me arrive and now stood by the door, his face grim. He was the family's lawyer, the unofficial secretary of the council. "Uncle Gene," I said, my voice cutting through the tension, regaining its formal executive tone, "I am officially requesting that you record the minutes of this meeting, starting now. As the company's COO, I am declaring this situation a material event with significant potential impact on shareholder value and corporate stability. We need a record." Outside the large bay window, one of my cousins pushed a child on a tree swing. The child soared into the air, his joyful shriek momentarily piercing the funereal silence of the library. Inside, the only sound was the soft, sharp crack of plastic against wood as the pen slipped from Sable's numb fingers and fell onto the desk. The sound of Sable's pen hitting the mahogany desk was a period at the end of a sentence they hadn't yet read. My Uncle Gene, a man who had spent 30 years navigating the sedate world of estate law, looked as though he'd just witnessed a car crash. His hand, holding his own pen above a legal pad, was trembling slightly. He was the record keeper now, and the record was turning ugly. I let the silence hang for a moment, a vacuum into which all their excuses and rationalizations could disappear. Then, I began the dissection. My tone was not that of an accuser, but of an auditor presenting findings, cold, factual, devoid of emotion. "Let's start with the basics," I said, picking up the first highlighted printout from the desk. It was a simple access log, a spreadsheet of times, dates, and ID numbers, the kind of mundane operational data I looked at every day. "This is the entry log for the primary server room at headquarters. For security, it's a cold room, accessible only by a handful of senior personnel. Your ID card, Sable, was one of them." I read from the page, my voice flat. "On the night of September 28th, at 2:13 a.m., employee ID 004, assigned to Sable Wynn, accessed server room 3B. The door was opened for 7 minutes. On the night of September 29th, at 2:19 a.m., the same ID accessed the same room for 12 minutes, and again on September 30th, at 2:27 a.m., for 9 minutes. I looked at her. "You were busy that week, sister." Her face was a mask of chalky white. I was working late, on the new HRS implementation." "A plausible explanation," I conceded. "Except for the security camera footage from the hallway." I gestured to the USB drive. "On this drive is a video file for each of those nights. The footage is partially obscured. At 2:12 a.m. on the 28th, our CEO, Damon Kress, can be seen walking down the hall. He stops just before coming into the camera's full view, removes his suit jacket, and hangs it over the camera lens. He does the same thing on the subsequent nights, a clumsy, almost comical attempt to create a blind spot. Unfortunately for you both, the audio sensors still recorded the distinct sound of the server room's magnetic lock releasing, twice each time, once for you to enter and once for you to leave." I let that image settle in the room. The CEO of a multi-million-dollar company acting like a teenager trying to sneak out of his parents' house. "Which brings us to the purpose of these late-night sessions," I continued, picking up the next document. It was a signed affidavit from our lead infrastructure engineer, a man named Ben Carter, who I had personally hired 7 years ago. Ben's report confirms that on those exact dates and times, an unauthorized download was initiated from the primary payroll server. A full copy of the master payroll ledger was downloaded. Then a new, modified version was uploaded in its place. He calls them the real and the white payrolls. The white version, the one now sitting on our live servers, has conveniently erased any trace of the 3 consultants you hired. Sable. I slid one of the invoices across the desk toward my father. His eyes, clouded with confusion and fear, dropped to the paper. "This is an invoice from a firm called Viridian Talent Solutions for $30,000 for executive recruitment services. Viridian is a shell company, Incorporated 6 months ago. You're listed as the sole director. Sable. The address is a P.O. box in a town you've never visited. The bank account number at the bottom of the page is the same account from which Damon's most loyal managers received their undeclared retention bonuses. I looked at my father. It's not a recruitment firm, Dad. It's a laundry, a funnel to move company money into the pockets of their allies. My mother made a small, wounded sound, but I didn't look at her. I turned the page in my small dossier. Of course, to make room for these new, loyal executives, you had to make some cuts. I held up a printout of an email from Sable, sent from her work account to 3 senior managers. The subject line is Personnel Optimization Program. In it, you provide them with a script for handling the termination of employees you've identified as being culturally misaligned. That's a lovely soft phrase for loyal to the wrong person. These are people who have worked for us for over a decade. You've reduced their years of service to a talking point in a soft-firing script. I paused, then reached for my phone, which I had placed on the desk. I tapped the screen. A recording began to play. It was only a few seconds long, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Damon Kress, his voice clear and confident. Don't worry about the board. Once the shares are transferred, the vote is just a formality. Make the call to the headhunter. Tell him we're officially replacing the COO. The reason is cultural incompatibility. She's just not a team player. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more profound than before. The banal corporate euphemisms, cultural incompatibility, personnel optimization, were suddenly exposed for the brutal weapons they were. With the evidence laid bare, I turned my full attention to my parents. They were the source of the power my sister sought to wield, the ones whose hands were meant to sign my career away. This is the change of control, I said, my voice losing its clinical edge, replaced by a quiet, firm finality. This paper, I tapped the proxy agreement again. This signature is the trigger. It is not a family document. It is a legal switch. The moment you sign it, you give Sable and Damon the power to enact their Operation Juniper. You also give the company's new creditor the legal, contractual right to demand $18 million. I held up the formal notice from my holding company. This is not a threat. It is a statement of intent. The legal filings are prepared. The moment a change of control is registered, this notice is electronically filed. The clock starts, and we do not have the liquid assets to cover it. You will bankrupt the company. Your company, Dad. Sable, who had been listening in a state of catatonic shock, finally found her voice. It was a ragged whisper, the sound of her entire future unraveling. You'd do it? She breathed, staring at me. You'd burn it all to the ground? You'd blow up the whole company just to get back at me? Her question was a last, desperate attempt to reframe the narrative, to paint me as the destroyer, the spiteful saboteur. But the facts were all there, laid out on the mahogany between us. I looked at her, my sister, my rival, the architect of this entire mess, and I delivered the final, clarifying truth. No, I said, my voice steady and clear. You already armed the bomb and set the timer when you decided that your ambition was more important than the truth. You already lit the fuse when you falsified reports and conspired to purge loyal employees. You already blew up this company. Sable. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes locked on hers. I'm just pushing the emergency stop button. The drive from Wynn Hollow back to the Northlake Dynamics headquarters was a silent 80-minute procession. The pastoral illusion of the family estate dissolved in the rearview mirror, replaced by the stark concrete and smoked glass of the corporate world. We were no longer a family in a library. We were executives and shareholders heading to a war room. We convened in the Kestrel boardroom at precisely 9:07 a.m. It was a space designed for dispassionate decision-making. A long glass table, 12 black leather chairs, and recessed fluorescent lighting that hummed with a sterile, electric hiss. The air conditioning was a cold, constant presence. Besides my parents, Sable, and Uncle Gene, the company's CFO, May Hollis, and 2 other non-family board members were present, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and grave concern. Damon Kress sat at the head of the table, his usual relaxed confidence replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. He attempted to seize control immediately, opening a leather-bound folder. "All right, everyone," he began, his voice a strained imitation of his usual command. "Clearly, we have a significant internal communications issue that has escalated unnecessarily. I propose we formulate a crisis management strategy to—" "This is not a communications issue. Damon," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his corporate jargon. The sound of it made him flinch. "This is a governance and fraud hearing, and it will be conducted on the record." I nodded to a small, unobtrusive camera mounted in the corner of the room. "I have taken the liberty of ordering this meeting to be officially recorded. Video and audio. A transcript will be produced. Uncle Gene will continue to take official minutes." Panic flickered in Damon's eyes. A recorded record was the one thing he couldn't spin. Before he could object, a new voice filled the room, emanating from the large speakerphone in the center of the table. It was the calm, measured voice of Marcus Thorne, my counsel. "If I may begin," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let the record show that as of 0800 hours this morning, Northlake Dynamics was formally notified that the debt obligation originally held by Argentus Capital has been legally transferred to a private entity named the Northlake Employee Stewardship Trust." A collective gasp went through the room. Sable shot out of her chair, her face contorted with rage. "A trust? Her trust! That's a conflict of interest. She's holding the company hostage." Marcus's voice remained unnervingly calm, the voice of a man swatting away a fly. "Objection overruled. On the grounds of factual inaccuracy. Ms. Wynne, the trust is an independent legal entity, the COO. Ms. Clara Wynne is not a beneficiary, a trustee, or an officer of said trust. She acted as an advisor in its formation, consistent with her fiduciary duty to explore options that protect the company's long-term stability. The purchase of the debt was legal, the notification was proper, and the covenant is in full force and effect. There is no conflict." His precise, legalistic dismantling of her accusation left her sputtering. She sank back into her chair, defeated. With the legal framework established, I took the floor. I used the remote to turn on the 80-inch screen at the end of the room. A spreadsheet appeared. 2 spreadsheets, side by side. "On the left," I began, using a laser pointer to highlight the columns, "you will see the original Q3 performance metrics, compiled from raw operational data. On the right, you will see the adjusted version that was included in the last report to our investors." The laser dot hovered over a final number. As you can see, the original data shows a 15% cost overrun on our primary freight routes since the implementation of the Gray Line contract. The adjusted version shows a 2% cost reduction. This is not an aesthetic adjustment, Damon. This is financial misrepresentation. This is fraud. Damon finally found his voice, a blustering, indignant tone. "This is outrageous. Any discrepancies are the fault of the third-party analytics vendor. Their software is clearly buggy. We've had issues with their integration for months." "A convenient explanation," I said, clicking the remote. The screen changed to display a scanned document. "This is Appendix B to the vendor contract, an addendum, authorizing the vendor to make manual data revisions upon direct request from the CEO's office. You signed it. Damon, your signature is right there." Click, the screen changed again. It now showed the screenshot of his email from his personal account, his request to the vendor to make the numbers look clean for the retreat. His face went ashen. He was trapped. "Furthermore," I said, turning to the 2 board members, 2 of our most senior logistics managers, Bill Farley and Maria Flores, are waiting on a video call. They have both prepared sworn statements confirming that they were directly pressured by both Mr. Kress and Miss Wynne to alter their initial reports, and that when they refused, the changes were made without their consent. The air in the room was thick with the weight of undeniable truth. The pieces were all there: the motive, the means, the cover-up. I looked at the assembled faces around the table. My father's, a portrait of anguish. My mother's, vacant and lost. May Hollis, the CFO, her lips a thin, hard line of fury. The other board members, their expressions grim and stony. In light of this evidence, I stated, my voice ringing with formal authority, I move for an immediate vote on the following resolution: that the board places an indefinite freeze on the transfer of any and all Wynn Family Trust voting shares, that Mr. Damon Kress be suspended from his duties as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, pending a full and independent forensic audit, and that Ms. Sable Wynn be placed on administrative leave from her position as Head of Human Resources, also effective immediately. I finished. The room was utterly still. All eyes turned to the head of the table, not to Damon, but to the chairman of the board, my father. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. He looked at Sable, her face a mask of hateful desperation. He looked at the evidence on the screen, a digital monument to the failure of his leadership and the corruption of his family. His hand, resting on the glass table, was shaking uncontrollably. I could see the war inside him, the father versus the chairman, the desire for peace versus the demand for justice. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, the father was gone. Only the chairman remained. "We will vote," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "all in favor of the resolution as proposed." My hand went up. May Hollis's hand went up. The two independent board members' hands went up. My Uncle Gene, after a moment of painful hesitation, slowly raised his hand. "All opposed," my father croaked. Two hands rose, Damon's and Sable's, a final, futile act of defiance. My father looked around the table, his gaze lingering for a moment on his disgraced daughter and the man who had helped her. "The resolution passes," he declared, his voice breaking. 5-2, Mr. Kress, Ms. Wynn, you are relieved of your duties. Please surrender your company access cards and devices to security. The verdict was delivered. The exchange of fire was over, and in the cold, fluorescent light of the Kestrel boardroom, a new order had begun. By 11:00 a.m., the Skylark Auditorium was full. It's our largest space, usually reserved for product launches and celebratory all-hands meetings. Today, it was a chamber of anxiety. An emergency town hall had been called with less than an hour's notice. Rumors were spreading like wildfire. Damon and Sable had been escorted from the building. The family reunion had been abruptly canceled. The company's intranet was a mess of frantic, speculative messages. Hundreds of employees sat in the tiered seats, their faces illuminated by the nervous glow of their phones. Hundreds more were watching on the internal live stream. They were scared. They smelled blood in the water, and they were afraid it was theirs. I walked onto the stage from the wings. There was no music, no introductory video, no slick slide deck on the massive screen behind me. The stage was empty except for a podium, which I ignored, and a simple rolling whiteboard. I felt the weight of every stare in the room, 1,000 invisible threads of fear and curiosity pulling at me. I walked to the center of the stage, picked up a black dry erase marker, and turned to the whiteboard. The cap came off with a soft squeak that echoed in the silent hall. I wrote 3 words, large, block letters. Truth. Payroll. Trust. I put the cap back on the marker with a definitive click and turned to face them. I gripped the edges of the whiteboard, my knuckles white. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady, amplified by the theater's speakers. "I know there are a lot of rumors flying around. My job right now is to replace them with facts. Let's start with the first word." I tapped the board. "Truth. For the last 6 months, the performance metrics and financial reports you've been seeing from executive leadership have been intentionally manipulated. The numbers were altered to hide cost overruns and to project a false narrative of success. The truth is, the company's performance has been declining. The truth is, you were lied to." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was worse than they thought. Which brings me to the second word. I pointed to payroll. This wasn't just about deceiving investors. This was about justifying a plan, codenamed Operation Juniper, to initiate a series of terminations and to slash employee benefits, including your 401k matching and healthcare contributions. The cuts were scheduled to begin next quarter. The falsified data was the excuse they were going to use to tell you that the company couldn't afford you anymore. The lie about the company's health was a direct threat to your family's health. Now there were sounds of anger. A man in the third row, a warehouse manager I'd known for years, shook his head in disgust. And that leads to the final word. I underlined trust. The trust between a company and its employees is our most valuable asset, more valuable than our trucks, our warehouses, our code. And that trust was deliberately broken by our former CEO, Damon Kress, and our former head of HR, Sable Wynn. Suddenly, there was a commotion from the side of the stage. A door burst open, and Sable herself stumbled into the light, her face pale, her eyes wild with a desperation that had tipped into madness. Security was a step behind her, but she was fast. She lunged for the microphone on the podium, grabbing it before they could reach her. "She's lying!" Sable shrieked into the mic, her voice a raw, hysterical sound that reverberated through the auditorium. "She's the one lying. She's doing all of this for revenge. She's trying to destroy this company because she's angry, because she wasn't invited to the family reunion." The accusation was so petty, so absurdly personal in the face of corporate fraud, that a stunned silence fell over the room. She was trying to frame a multi-million-dollar conspiracy as a family squabble over a party invitation. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and held it up to my own lapel microphone. I pressed play. An audio clip filled the hall. It was only 12 seconds long. It was Sable's voice, but not the hysterical shriek they had just heard. This voice was cold, clear, and calculating. "He's weak. He'll do what Mom says. Just get her out of the picture, and the voting shares will consolidate with me. It's the only way." I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so deep, so profound, that it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Every employee in that hall, every person on that live stream, now understood the real motive. It wasn't about a party. It was about a premeditated, cold-blooded seizure of power. From the middle of the crowd, a single, whispered voice was clearly audible in the stillness. "Holy!" Sable stood frozen, the microphone hanging from her limp hand. The security guards gently took her by the arms, and she didn't resist. She was no longer a threat. She was just a ghost, exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light. They led her off the stage. I took a deep breath and turned back to the audience. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the moment. The trust was broken. Now, we begin to rebuild it. I looked out at their faces: warehouse workers, software engineers, truck drivers, accountants. Effective immediately, all planned benefit reductions are canceled, the full 401k match, and all current healthcare provisions are being restored to their original levels, retroactive to the beginning of this year. Furthermore, we will be conducting a full salary and bonus review based on the company's real performance data. The money that was being funneled into ghost accounts will be rerouted back where it belongs, to you. A single person began to clap, then another, then a dozen more. A wave of relief and gratitude was starting to build. I held up a hand, and they quieted. I had one more thing to say. "Family businesses are complicated," I said, my voice resonating with a final, unshakable conviction. "But let me be clear about one thing. Family reunions are for passing potato salad, not for plotting corporate coups." I looked out across the sea of faces, meeting as many eyes as I could. This company does not belong to a single family. It belongs to the people in this room, to the people on the road, and in the warehouses. It belongs to all of us. Now, let's get back to work. The sound that erupted was not just applause. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound, of relief, of fury, of loyalty reborn. It washed over the stage, a deafening, sustained ovation that felt like a foundation being set back into place, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was finally home. The thunder of the applause slowly subsided, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The energy in the auditorium had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a fragile, dawning sense of hope. I stood on the stage, taking it all in, the faces of the people whose trust I had just fought to reclaim. As the last few claps faded, a single hand was raised at the very back of the hall. It belonged to a woman I had never met in person, but whose face I knew from weeks of research. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of professional calm. She didn't wait for a microphone. Her voice was clear and carried through the quiet room. "My name is Elise Carr," she said. "I'm a managing partner at Argentus Capital." A new wave of whispers went through the room. This was the original creditor, the firm that had, for all they knew, held a gun to the company's head. Elise continued, her gaze fixed on me. "I'm here today as an observer. I want to confirm for the record that 2 weeks ago, Argentus Capital was approached by an intermediary. We were made a fair offer to sell our debt position in Northlake Dynamics. This is not unusual. What was unusual was the nature of the buyer's request. They made it clear that their primary objective was not financial leverage for its own sake. Their stated goal, and I quote from their mission statement, was to provide a legal and financial backstop to protect the long-term interests and security of the company's labor force. She paused, letting the words sink in. We see predatory acquisitions all the time. This was the opposite. It was a defensive acquisition. We analyzed the situation, saw the signs of internal mismanagement that they pointed out to us, and concluded that selling the debt to this entity was the most stable and ethical path forward. We sold because we were given a promise that the power of the covenant would be used to protect the people in this room. All eyes turned back to me. The question was unspoken but palpable. Who was this mysterious buyer? Who had made that promise? I took the microphone from the podium. My voice was quiet now, the adrenaline of the confrontation replaced by a sense of solemn purpose. The entity that purchased the debt, I announced, is the Northlake Employee Stewardship Trust, or NEST, for short. I explained what it was, a trust I had spent the last month establishing with Marcus Thorne, its charter legally binding and ironclad. It was a perpetual trust, set up for a single purpose, to benefit the active employees of Northlake Dynamics. Let me be absolutely clear about how NEST works, I said, looking out at the crowd. No single individual profits from it. I am not a beneficiary. My family members are not beneficiaries. The power of the debt covenant cannot be used for personal enrichment or a hostile takeover. Its power can only be invoked under specific circumstances of gross mismanagement or actions that threaten the company's solvency and the security of its workers. It is a fail-safe, a financial emergency brake. Any and all proceeds that might ever come from it are legally mandated to be reinvested into employee profit sharing, pensions, and benefit programs. I could see the final pieces clicking into place on the faces before me. This wasn't a power grab. It was an abdication of power. It was taking the weapon of corporate debt and turning it into a shield for the workers. In my mind, I pictured Sable and Damon, watching this on a screen in some empty office. Their final narrative, that I was a corporate raider, a bitter sister staging a coup for personal gain, had just evaporated. They hadn't been outmaneuvered by a rival. They had been defeated by a principal. I glanced to the front row, where my parents were sitting with the board members. My father was looking at my mother, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of understanding, of dawning comprehension in his eyes. He finally understood. I hadn't come to burn his house down. I had come to put out the fire, to reinforce the foundation, to fix the track that his negligence had allowed to rust and decay. The speakerphone on a small table near the stage crackled to life. It was Marcus Thorne. "A further announcement," his voice boomed with legal authority. "As part of this restructuring, We have reached a preliminary agreement with the data analytics vendor, Greyline Freight. In exchange for immunity from prosecution for their role in the data manipulation, they have agreed to full cooperation. They will assist in a complete restoration of all historical data and will issue a full refund for any and all overcharges incurred as a result of the fraudulent KPI reporting. A cheer went up from the logistics and accounting teams. It was a clear sign. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about recovery. Then, Bill Farley, one of the operations managers who had been pressured to alter his numbers, stood up from his seat in the audience. "On behalf of the operations division," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like to say thank you. Clara, Maria and I would like to formally volunteer to co-chair the new internal audit committee. We'll make sure this never happens again." The final piece of the transition slotted into place. My father stood up, looking less like a broken man and more like the chairman he was supposed to be. "The board has just concluded an emergency vote," he announced. "We have unanimously appointed our CFO, Ms. May Hollis, as interim chief executive officer, effective immediately." May, a brilliant, no-nonsense woman who had been with the company for 15 years, stood and gave a short, determined nod to the cheering crowd. The company was stable. The leadership was in place. The path forward was clear. As the applause began anew, Elise Carr, the woman from Argentus Capital, caught my eye from the back of the room. She gave me a small, respectful nod and added one final thought, her voice cutting through the noise with quiet authority. "Numbers are afraid of sunlight," she said, her words a perfect epitaph for the old regime. "Thank you for opening the window." The town hall ended not with a bang, but with a slow, collective exhale. The employees dispersed in small, buzzing groups, their voices a low hum of speculation and relief. The storm had broken, and now came the quiet, steady rain of consequence. I didn't stay for the back-patting or the questions. I took a service elevator down to the ground-floor parking garage. The air was cool and still, smelling of damp concrete and old exhaust fumes. The rhythmic hum of the ventilation system was the only sound. It was a space of pure function, a concrete purgatory between the office and the outside world. My footsteps echoed as I walked toward my car, parked in its designated spot. COO, a title that meant something different now than it had this morning. I was halfway to my vehicle when a figure stepped out from behind a thick concrete pillar, blocking my path. It was Sable. Her suit was rumpled. Her perfect hair was slightly askew. The polished armor she wore so effortlessly had been stripped away, and for the first time in years, she just looked like my sister, small and lost between two rows of dark, silent cars. The harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights overhead bleached the color from her face, casting long shadows under her eyes. She just stood there for a moment, watching me. I stopped a few feet away, waiting. The hum of the ventilation filled the silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, a raw, scraped sound. "If I had invited you last night, if I had just said, 'Clara, please come,' would any of this have been different?" It was the question of a person still searching for a different path in a story that was already over, a desperate belief that a single, different choice could have rewritten the entire script. I gave her the truth. "No," I said, my voice flat, holding no anger, only fact. "It wouldn't have made a difference, because you had already signed the plan. You had already written the termination scripts. The invitation was never the issue. Sable, the intent was..." Her shoulders slumped, the last of her fight, her last attempt to reframe her actions as a simple social misstep, drained out of her. She looked down at the oil-stained concrete floor, then back up at me. Her eyes were wet. "What do you want from me, Clara?" Her voice trembled, the question a plea for a sentence, for a final judgment. I had the answer ready. It was not born of vengeance, but of necessity. The system had been poisoned, and the poison had to be drawn out. "I want two things," I said. "First, a public email, sent to all employees, in which you apologize, not for being caught, for your actions, for the falsified data, and for the planned terminations. I paused. Second, I want a full, written confession delivered to the board of directors, detailing your role and Damon's in the financial misrepresentation and the misuse of company funds. No omissions. She swallowed hard, a convulsive movement in her throat. "I'll lose everything," she whispered. The words were a statement of her greatest fear, her career, her reputation, her place in the world she had tried to build. I looked at her, my sister, who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of ownership. "No," I said, the word precise and clean. "You'll lose the things you were never entitled to keep." That was it, the final, simple truth. You cannot lose what was never rightfully yours. The trust of the employees, the integrity of the company, the power you tried to seize. It was all an illusion. A long moment passed. She stared at me. Her eyes, once a weapon of charm and public relations, now just the eyes of a person at the end of a long, wrong road. I could see the calculation, the final weighing of her options. There were none left. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was not an agreement. It was a surrender. I didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. I simply took out my phone, unlocked it, and held it out to her. On the screen was a draft email I had composed in my office an hour ago. It was addressed to the all-staff distribution list. It was short, direct, and without rhetoric. It was an apology and a confession, stripped of all excuses. To the employees of Northlake Dynamics, it began, "I am writing to issue a formal and unequivocal apology for my actions." She took the phone from my hand. I watched her read the words I had written for her, her expression unreadable. She reached the bottom. Her finger, the same one that was meant to sign the proxy agreement, hovered over the blue send button. It was trembling violently. For a second, I thought she might not do it, that some final defiant spark of her old self would refuse. But then, she closed her eyes, took a shallow breath, and her finger tapped the screen. The email was gone. Sent. Irrevocable. She handed the phone back to me, her hand empty, her face a blank canvas. She didn't say another word. She just turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing until they were swallowed by the vast, empty silence of the garage. I stood there for another moment. I looked down at my phone's screen, then glanced at the time in the top corner. 1:47 p.m. The storm had passed. At 2:15 p.m., I was in the driver's break room on the ground floor of the main distribution hub. It was a simple, functional space that smelled of burnt coffee and diesel fumes. A worn-out sofa sat against one wall, and a small television was mounted in the corner, silently playing a sports highlights show. I hadn't come with an announcement or a speech. I came with 2 large boxes of donuts from the best bakery in town. I placed them on the central table, amidst the scattered newspapers and coffee mugs. The half-dozen drivers from the afternoon shift looked up, surprised to see me there. I just nodded, opened the boxes, and took a seat on one of the cracked vinyl chairs. For a few moments, nobody moved. Then, a big bearded driver named Sal, a man who had been with the company since the beginning, reached over and took a glazed donut. That broke the spell. Soon, the others were helping themselves, and the quiet rhythm of the break room returned, punctuated by the soft sounds of coffee being poured and men at rest. We sat in a comfortable silence. We didn't talk about the board meeting or the town hall. We talked about the traffic on the interstate, a new route to the West Coast, the absurd price of fuel. We talked about work, the real work. My phone, sitting on the table, buzzed. A notification from the company's internal messaging app lit up the screen. A new email had been delivered to all employees. The subject line was simple: an apology. I didn't need to open it. I saw the first line of the preview. It was Sable's name. A quiet ripple went through the room as other phones buzzed in pockets. The news spreading silently, digitally, through the veins of the company. The poison was being publicly drawn out. Sal took a bite of his donut, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at me. His voice was low, almost a mumble. "Thanks, boss." I met his gaze. It was a look of respect, the kind you earn, not the kind you inherit. "Call me Clara," I said. I picked up my own phone. I opened a message thread to my parents. They had been trying to call me for the last hour. I ignored the missed calls and typed a single sentence. "I won't be coming to the family reunion today." I scrolled through my camera roll, found a photo someone had sent me from the town hall. A wide shot of the auditorium, filled with employees, some clapping, some embracing, a picture of a company coming back together. I attached it to the message and pressed send. No explanation was necessary. My reunion was here. My phone vibrated again almost immediately. It was a text from May Hollis, our new interim CEO. "Payroll program is live. All restorations will be reflected in this Friday's pay cycle. The audit committee is being formed. We're moving." I read the message, a simple confirmation that the gears were already turning. The system was correcting itself. The machine was healing. I typed back a short reply. "Thank you. May, keep me posted." I turned the phone over, placing it face down on the table. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the small, wire mesh window of the break room. It offered a limited view of the loading bay, but above the concrete and steel, I could see a patch of the pale blue Brookshore sky. There was no sense of triumph, no exhilarating rush of victory. The desire for more revenge, for a final crushing blow, had vanished. It had been replaced by a quiet, profound sense of order. The numbers were real again. The work was honest again. That was enough. The break room door swung shut, closing with a soft whoosh of air. Outside, in the loading bay, a forklift started its engine, its low, steady rumble vibrating through the concrete floor. It was a familiar, rhythmic sound, the sound of the company's heart, returning to its steady, reliable beat. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.